Welcome, everybody. First of all, as you see, today is online only, and Quentin has agreed to be recorded. So everybody to be aware that this will be recorded. So if they don't want to put the cameras on, that's perfectly fine. And it will be available through the Institute of Classical Studies website, probably in 1 week or in 2 weeks. Some people can have a look back at it then. So thank you very much, Quentin, for allowing us to do that. Before we start as well, I just wanted to talk about the next Mycenaean seminar. It will be by Kim Shelton from UC Berkeley, and it will be on the cemeteries of Edonia with updates and insights from the TAFOS project. This will take place on the 15th of March. At the same time, wherever in the world you are at the moment, it will be at the same time. And you will need to register. I just put the link to register in the chat so everybody can start registering. It will take place hybrid. So it will be in person, but it will be as well streamed to anybody that wants to join us. Okay. So that's the little bit of housekeeping that we needed. So I move on to introduce our today's speaker, Quentin Letesson from University Catholic Louvain, or the other UCL, as we may call it at UCL. Okay, Quentin is probably one of the most dynamic researchers of my generation. Got a PhD in 2007 with University Catholic Louvain on architecture of Neo-Palatial Crete. And since then, well, actually before that, has been as well working in mainly 2 projects, which is the Palekastor project since 2003. So almost celebrating his 20 years there. And then from Sissi in 2007. He has produced more than 40 publications related to his work in architecture, but as well on system collapse, and as well working recently on the Thera eruption. We probably all have come across his publications, including his monograph, which the name I'm not going to tell because my French is horrible and probably people cannot find it, but it was on phenotype and genotype on the architecture of Neo-Palatial Crete. Today, he is going to basically talk about one of the main areas of his research, which is architecture and houses. And for that, he's going to present us new evidence, which is always super interesting to see coming from the excavations from Sissi. Okay, I think that now, Quentin, is all yours. If you want to share your screen and take the floor or the virtual floor.
Is that all right?
Yeah, perfectly fine.
Okay. First of all, I would like to thank the organizing committee for inviting me to present part of our recent excavations at Sissi, and Borja for his kind introduction. There seems to be a bit of a bug. There we go. Most of you don't normally need an extensive introduction to where or what Sissi is, but I'll still set up the stage very briefly. Sissi is a small settlement located on the north coast of Crete, a few kilometers east of Mallia. Under the auspices of the Belgian school at Athens, the site has been excavated by UCLouvain with Jan Driessen as director since 2007. Sissi presents extensive remains spanning the entirety of the Bronze Age, roughly between 2600 to 1250 BCE. But today, I'll focus on a particular area located immediately west of the court building, which yielded the remains of several early Bronze Age structures that we now interpret as part of a small prepalatial village, although the term village is still a bit over-optimistic at the current stage of excavation. Early Minoan remains, of course, exist elsewhere on the site, and I'll come back to some of these later on. During its earliest history, we know that the Kefali at Sissi was part of a series of small hamlets dotting the coast of the larger Mallia Bay. During the survey of the Malia Plain, Sylvie Muller indeed located 2 EM2 sites, whereas in the 60s, Sinclair Hood, Peter Warren, and Gerald Cadogan located an EM2 site half underwater in the bay to the east of Sissi, while the underwater Euphoria explored yet another EM2 site further to the east on the same bay. With the remains I'll describe today on the Kefali, this means that at least 5 separate hamlets may have coexisted in the coastal plain of Sissi. At Malia itself, EM2A and EM2B sherds have been found over a relatively large area, but the nature of the occupation is obscured by later reoccupation and reuse. An important building, possibly monumental in nature, however, already existed beneath the later palace, and several of the early Minoan walls were incorporated into it. This is important since we will see the same thing happening at Sissi. In contrast to Malia, though, where the EM2A phase is barely known, exception is the recent publication of Bâtiment de Seine by Maud de Volder and Ilaria Calloy, recent excavations at Sissi have yielded important settlement remains, especially in the area I mentioned earlier, immediately west of the court building. The archaeological potential of this area was highlighted thanks to a geophysical survey conducted by Apostolos Sarris' team in 2016. They were able to identify a series of potential built features, and towards the north, weaker reflection signals suggested the existence of an open area. As you can see on this slide, these results were pretty accurate, judging by the fairly good match between the GPR and the excavation results. These GPR results led to the excavation between 2018 and 2022 of an area of roughly 350 square meters, which revealed the existence of at least 2 well-preserved prepalatial buildings. The orientation of the main walls, north, northwest, south, southeast, contrast with the north, northeast, south, southwest orientation of the court building just next to it. The state of preservation of the architectural remains is surprisingly good, considering that the wall tops were only some 10 to 20 centimeters below topsoil. Most of the walls seem to have been built immediately on top of the underlying bedrock, which appears in some areas and was probably cut and used as a floor surface, together with the usual clay floors encountered in several rooms. Before turning to the actual buildings, it is worth mentioning their immediate surroundings, especially exposed to the west and south and composed of more or less worked bedrock surfaces, locally equipped with a variety of features. Areas of unworked bedrock are usually characterized by the presence of a reddish, flaky sedimentary stone that, according to our micromorphologist Laura Magnot, could eventually disintegrate into a sort of terra rossa, the type of red clayish material often used in prepalatial floors at Sissi. This flaky material is usually sedimented on top of a hard limestone, locally flattened. And now I'll move to number 2. Immediately connected to one of the entrances of the first building is a small rudimentary paved surface, labeled Calderim on this slide. The area probably formed a small courtyard facing the building, and it led to it through an opening in room 1021, the room that you can see on top of the left part of the slide. Apart from the sherds, obsidian blades and nuclei, lithic tools, and numerous stalactite fragments that constitute the usual assemblages of our prepalatial deposits, cleaning the Calderim also yielded a gold pendant that you can see on the right of the screen. As underlined by the team studying the gold material at Sissi, to which Bocha belonged, this type of gold jewelry has good parallel in funerary contexts in sites such as Moklos and Ayatriada. This specific piece may, however, represent one of the first instances in which this type of a gold pendant has been found outside of a cemetery on Crete. Immediately south of the prepalatial building, the much harder bedrock was obviously leveled and 4 cavities cut, or rather drilled, in it. Their actual function is still unclear. At first, we hypothesized that they could somehow be functionally related to the prepalatial buildings, as receptacles for rainwater for the shallow ones, as suggested by some of our workmen, or post holes for the deeper one in relation to an artisanal activity requiring an upright wooden pole, for example, the support of a weight in a press. Similar man-made depressions at Jalepa at Pachiamos, mentioned 2 weeks ago in an INSTAP lecture by Melissa Eby and Chrissa Sofianou, have been interpreted as potential fire pits or mortars. But it is only with the discovery of many additional cavities in the bedrock to the west of the prepalatial buildings that the possibility that they may have been part of the layout of a wooden building dawned on us. These man-made cavities contained almost no material and are consequently difficult to date. Similar cylindrical cavities have also been found at Petraskefala and Castellijana, and in both cases, they seem to have been dug during the transitional final Neolithic period, before the erection of the buildings of the EM1 phase on these sites. At Castellijana, they were interpreted as post holes related to pile dwelling, very early hut-like buildings. So there is a possibility that we have, with these cylindrical cavities, an attestation of a early occupation of the Sissi site. Unfortunately, as it is very often the case, this curvy alignment of holes seem to continue further south in an unexcavated area of the site. It is also worth noting that some of these cavities, despite being found mostly empty, still had the occasional fragment of shell, triton or cowrie shell, or a piece of stalactite at their very bottom. These could be coincidental, as they only appear in the southern cavities, but could also represent some sort of depositional practice, maybe related to the closure of these cavities. And you can see these shells and pieces of stalactite in the middle of the slide. To the southwest of the prepalatial buildings, 2 features built in bedrock cavities were also identified. The first one was made of a carved-out stone embedded in a cavity and wedged into place by a small upright slab, and you see it on the left hand of the slide. It could form a trough or a gorna. It was found empty. The second one, also set in a bedrock cavity, is made of a broken quern and flat field stones forming a box-like feature that was probably covered by a slab found fallen in it. The bottom level of this feature was paved with sherds. Although it definitely looks like an oven of some kind, not a single trace of burning or ash was found inside. The full sediment content of both features was collected and will be further analyzed in the hope that it will reveal something about their actual use. But it's probably not too far-fetched to imagine that these features were related to small craft activities associated with the nearby buildings. Let us now move to the first and only fully excavated of these buildings, Building 1. Building 1 comprises 4 rooms and covers about 50 square meters. It presents a roughly rectangular shape, broken in its north part by an apsidal room, which extends further to the west. It is accessible by 2 entrances, one leading into room 1021, the other into room 24. The first entrance is connected to the Calderim and is marked by a pebble surface and a door socket. The second entrance appears more rudimentary, but is nonetheless associated with a stretch of worked bedrock. As a rule, buildings forming the prepalatial hamlet preserved a lot of material in situ, and we came upon good assemblages in all rooms. And I'm going to give you a brief presentation of the different rooms of that building, Building 1. Room 1021, covering about 10 square meters, was equipped with a large pebble platform, a recurrent feature within the buildings, as we shall see. Stratigraphically speaking, the destruction levels of Building 1 were reached immediately after topsoil removal. In its stratigraphy, the room contains good evidence that the building was abandoned for a period of time before its wall collapsed. The floor level of the room was made of clay, locally strewn with tiny pebbles. Its archaeological assemblage comprised a large set of stone tools, querns, obsidian blades, part of a beehive, a few cooking pots, and 2 miniature juglets to which we will return. Room 1020 is connected by means of a narrow doorway to room 1021. This small room was equipped with a niche and a hearth. The deposit associated with the latter contained a good assemblage of pottery, including both fragmentary and almost entirely mendable vases. As underlined by our pottery specialist, Ilaria Caloi, these vessels are mostly produced in the following ceramic classes: black burnished ware, plain semi-fine and semi-coarse ware, both in red fabric, pittos ware in light fabric, and cooking ware. In terms of shape, we found several shallow bowls, plates, as well as storage and cooking vessels. A miniature juglet in red semi-coarse ware was also collected, and you can see it on the right of the screen. The presence of charcoal and ashes and a large amount of bones and shells further confirm that this space was used for cooking activities. Room 1024 measures about 4.4 square meters. It presents three distinctive features: a L-shaped bench, a small pebble platform in its northwest corner, and a curvilinear feature which presumably formed some sort of installation to prevent rainwater from getting in the room, while allowing one to step into it from the area of leveled bedrock. The room also contained miniature juglets, like the black slip juglet with a low-bellied profile you can see on the left of this slide, or a series of juglets in semi-fine, semi-coarse planeware with a cylindrical profile and vertical handle on the right. Room 1025 is an apsidal room covering roughly 10 square meters and built on an east-west axis. The room is equipped with a small niche along its south wall. In its west half, the occupation surface was made of leveled bedrock, whereas to the east, we found evidence of a dense stone packing or leveling fill, on top of which two distinct floors were built with additional evidence of multiple relayings per floor. These relayings were identified by Laura Magno, who also noted that deeper cavities in the bedrock within the room were filled with a carefully prepared sandy soil, as attested by the very homogeneous granulometry of the material. This clearly indicates a certain degree of expertise and meticulousness in building technology. Besides the usual lithic tools, obsidian blades and nuclei, as well as vats and some other large containers, what is particularly striking in the room is the very high number of miniature vessels it contained. These were mostly concentrated in the middle of the room and in its small niche. The assemblage comprised roughly 20 juglets and a large number of what have been dubbed raki cups. Juglets were of three types: jugular, like the ones we saw just before, piriform and made in a local semi-coarse fabric with large inclusions of calcite, and finally, there were also few specimens of juglets with a low belly profile and a long beak in plain semi-fine ware. As indicated by a well-preserved specimen, the raki cups had two symmetrical holes right under their rim. They were probably meant to be suspended and or attached together as a set. I will come back to these miniature vessels later on, but I can already point out that overall, the pottery found in the floor deposits of Building 1 is quite homogeneously EM2A late, as determined by Ilaria Caloi, or a pottery specialist. And those who attended the Instat lecture on Jalepa will have noticed the differences in ceramics. This late date is proposed by Ilaria mainly because of the absence of fine painted ware and fine gray ware that are fairly common in EM2A early assemblages. If Ilaria is online with us today, and she will have to leave at some point because she's giving classes, she told me, she would gladly enlighten you on the parallels she found for the pottery assemblage from the prepalatial building, as this is quite clearly out of my comfort zone. Where the rest of the prepalatial structures is concerned, it is still unclear if we have one or more than one additional buildings. Currently, the situation is particularly difficult to assess. First, because the area east of Building 1 had a later intrusion, the only one thus far. A neopalatial plastered room, room 1022 that you can see on the right of the screen, indeed covered at least part of the prepalatial remains. Secondly, because the building comprising room 1027, 28, and 29, and presumably the new rooms unearthed to the north, is still largely unexcavated. Some elements are nonetheless worth noting about these structures. In room 1026, we found more traces of wall collapse, fairly similar to those of Building 1, a small pebble platform, and a niche. The latter also contained miniature vessels. On this slide, you can also see that the northern wall of the neopalatial plastered room running over the south wall of room 1026. At the current stage of excavation, it is difficult to determine if room 1026 is a later addition to the first building or part of the second one. The fact that the south wall of room 1027 and 28 and the south wall and threshold of room 1019 both appear to abut walls circumscribing room 1026, where the red arrows are pointing, are nonetheless in favor of the second hypothesis. A last option would be that room 1026 belonged to a third structure that was dismantled or covered by neopalatial constructions. Room 1029 is missing its eastern limit, but appears to have been accessible by means of a threshold abutting wall 543. The room features a few bedrock cavities. It is hard to know if they were simple and integral part of the prepalatial use of the room or testify to an earlier occupation of this part of the hill. 1029 also had a rather large and carefully built platform in its northwest corner. Its outline is delimited by medium-sized stones and slabs, among which a clear saddle quern is visible, whereas its central part is made of a dense packing of smaller field stones. What was particularly striking in the room is the massive EM2B pottery fill it contained. Beside a huge concentration of sherds, this fill also contained many animal bones, fragments of charcoal, some lithic tools, and a very significant number of goat horn cores, close to 45 of them in total. A single miniature juglet was also found in the area, as well as part of a pithos. This very dense EM2B pottery fill was also identified and mostly removed in the area excavated to the north of room 1027 and 28 in 2022. Here, several architectural features were delineated, but excavation was interrupted by torrential rains at the end of the 2022 season. So what can be told about the area is really provisional. There nonetheless seems to be another apsidal room connected to room 1028 and may be subdivided into by wall 542. Further to the north, a potential facade wall with a threshold was also identified. Room 1027 and room 1028 are rectangular rooms of about 12 square meters connected in their northern part by a button bend opening. Although these rooms have been barely excavated, traces of a pebble platform are apparent in both of them on both sides of wall 531. A large outcrop of flattened bedrock with man-made cavities also connects the northern part of the two rooms. An entrance is also tentatively reconstructed in the eastern wall of room 1027, as there is a significant gap in the otherwise well-preserved masonry of the walls. More work is, of course, needed in the area. To conclude with the description of the archaeological remains, it may be worth mentioning a very large tilted monolithic rock slab brought to light just west of the prepalatial remains and partly covered by later neopalatial layers. Its size and weight certainly preclude that it is very far from its original position. It also seems to continue below the level we stopped at and could even extend deeper than the clear prepalatial surface reached in unit 6257 that you can see on the bottom right of your slide. More work is needed to determine if there was a relation between the prepalatial hamlet and this potential standing stone. In this second part of the talk, I would like to underline a few things of what we know so far of the EM2A hamlet at Sissi and to discuss some issues that could help to better contextualize it within the prepalatial period at Sissi and on the island, but also in relation to current debates on early Bronze Age social organization and the emergence of complexity. First, I stress again that all these remarks are provisional, not only because the whole extent of these structures remain unknown, but also because pottery, paleoenvironmental, and other types of analysis are still ongoing. Let us start by talking about settlement size, morphology, and organization. If one compares the area covered by the prepalatial buildings at Sissi to the best-known EM2 village at Myrtos-Fournocorrifi, it is clear that we can hardly label a remains village right now. Hamlet is probably a better term. But one is to keep in mind that Myrtos-Fournocorrifi current remains are mostly EM2B and were built around deserted EM2A houses. Despite this chronological difference, it is important to spend some time highlighting some of the characteristics of Fourneau-Coryphae, as to date, it is one of the best documented EM2 sites on the island. This may, to some extent, help us to better understand the remains we have at Sissi. Todd Whitelow sees the EM2B phase at Fourneau-Coryphae as, and I quote, a community grown as a result of the accretionary addition of different households, end of quote. In his 2007 in-depth analysis of the site, he identified recurrent complementary sets of functions in each architecturally distinct room cluster and proposed that each cluster represented a household. On the basis of the floor area of these households and its strong correlations with the number of vessels preserved and the agricultural storage capacity represented by said vessels, he highlighted that the number of individuals using the space and the artifacts corresponded to a nuclear family, a hypothesis backed up by comparisons with ethnographic data from non-urbanized agricultural societies. His remarks concerning what he calls the standard module of the layout at Fourneau-Coryphae houses are also worth repeating. Each house had a large room used for various functions: storage, food preparation and consumption, and probably sleeping. 2 smaller rear rooms used for production, processing, and storage, and often a separate detached kitchen. Finally, Whitelow noted that although it was clearly a community of independent households, obvious ties bound the community together, since, and I quote, the individual households chose to live together on a dry hilltop rather than disperse closer to their agricultural fields and water sources in the valleys below the site, end of quote. He noted that such cohesion could be traditional to a degree, as the community probably grew from a single household through time, but also pointed out the existence of economic cooperation and active social integration. Whitelow saw the evidence for economic cooperation in the fact that only 2 houses apparently had looms, whereas many of them had spindle wheels. This pattern of economic or artisanal cooperation between households can even be traced earlier during the Prepalatial period. For example, Melissa Eby and Chrysasofianou recently argued that in EM1B Chalepa, the courtyard around which several buildings of the partially excavated site seemed to be organized probably hosted specialized industrial activities. In such a configuration, it is quite tempting to see the various households collaborating in craft activities in an open space they shared. We could have the same situation at Sissi. As I've shown you earlier, potential artisanal installations have been found outside the building, but in their immediate vicinity. Where active social integration is concerned, Todd Whitelow underlined the existence of, and I quote, spaces not integrated into individual houses, lanes, corridors, leading from each entrance, each flanked by an isolated room with a bench, to small open courts near the center of the community. Opening off each of the 3 public courts is a small isolated room, each of which has a distinctive worked stone feature. In 2 cases, kernos, stones set in their thresholds, end of quote. He then suggested that these areas and features, such as the kernos, something that appear quite recurrently afterwards in Crete in domestic, funerary, or palatial contexts, point towards the existence of contexts for group activities, probably of a ritual nature that would serve to integrate the small community. On this topic, again, Eby and Sofianou, in their last talk on Chalepa 2 weeks ago, noted the existence of a large slab with many cavities found north of Building 1 at that site. Despite the fact that the stone wasn't probably in situ, or that the hollows don't seem to form any clear pattern, maybe it's not too far-fetched to suggest that such a slab may have been a rudimentary kernos originally placed near or in the courtyard. One kernos was also found in the so-called west court of nearby Vasiliki, where people from Chalepa may have moved in EM2A when the site was abandoned. With this in mind, let us move back to Sissi. The Sissi prepalatial buildings are important because they form one of the few well-preserved EM2A structures on the island, And currently, with EM2A early levels found under the west wing of the court building at the site, the earliest securely attested traces of occupation at Sissi. It is also interesting to note that, as they probably date to the EM2A late period, they sit chronologically right between Chalepa, Mezoraki, or Petraskephalla on the one hand, and on the between the main phase of Myrtos Fournokoriffi and Vasiliki on the other. So let us see if this allows us to contextualize and or offer some insights on the remains at Sissi. In terms of building morphology, the apsidal nature of at least two distinct rooms at Sissi is worth mentioning, as for quite some time, oval or apsidal rooms were considered fairly rare in Minoan architecture, with MM1A Camesi often presented as a noticeable exception. At Camesi, however, the layout may have been forced by the topography of the site. Recent excavations have revealed more apsidal or oval buildings in East Crete. At Mezoraki, where there is an EM1A apsidal building and an EM1B oval one, at Chalepa in Pachiamos with two apsidal houses and one oval one dating from EM1B and abandoned in EM2A, but there are also rounded walls at Aphrodite Kephali and Petraskephalla. So there seems to be an early Minoan tradition of apsidal or oval buildings that needs to be investigated further. It's persistent through time. Its use attested on the whole eastern half of the island, and the fact that these buildings were erected on fairly flat areas and not too constrained by topography could indicate that this tradition was more than simply, and I quote Melissa Eby, a local experimentation with architecture, end of quote. Another distinctive feature is the agglutinative layout of the buildings, typical of the prepalatial period. Rooms open onto one another without any transitional space in between them, while distinct buildings or later developments are added progressively, a phenomenon characterized by the presence of double walls, well attested at sites like Myrtos Fournokoriffi. It may be more anecdotal, but in terms of construction techniques, the masonry at Sissi is extremely similar to that of Chalepa. Walls measure between 50 to 55 centimeters in width. Some are a bit more than that for external walls. They are often double-faced with local true stones and clearly built with local materials. Where the societal makeup of prepalatial household is concerned, some scholars, like Todd Whitelow, argued, like I already said, that houses were inhabited by nuclear families, whereas others, like Jan Driessen, defend the existence of larger corporate groups. I personally sit between a rock and a hard place. More seriously, though, I don't think that these hypotheses are mutually exclusive. Jan and I were fairly clear about that in recent papers, the one published in the Oikos volume of the Aegis series, and another one soon to be published in the Journal of Archaeological Research. Whereas Todd, who kindly read the latter, didn't seem too bothered by the idea. In many cases, however, like at EM1 Petraskephalla, EM2 Ayatriada with the west and east houses, EM1B Chalepa, or even EM2B Vasiliki if one follows the hypothesis of a multi-phase village community rather than one of a monumental building, one must admit that the size of the buildings and their material assemblages are rather in favor of the nuclear or minimally extended family hypothesis. So if corporate groups came into play, their existence was certainly related to the areas of active social integration I mentioned earlier, such as the open courts associated with a small room and kernos at Myrtos Fournokoriffi. One can then say that corporate groups were simply a higher level of integration between different households and the overall community. This is basically the way corporate groups were originally defined in the literature. And I quote Hayden and Cannon, "Groups that function as individuals in relation to property as a result of strong economic or environmental pressure and which exhibit a recognizable degree of residential coherency among two or more nuclear families within the community." At Sissi, several distinctive features may point towards a slightly different situation. First of all, in the two buildings we have so far, there is more than one entrance. For buildings of roughly similar sizes, unless I'm mistaken, this never happens at Chalepa or Myrtosfournocorriffi. This could indicate that somehow the buildings had to be accessible in different ways or by different groups or subgroups. The duplication of features within the same building is particularly intriguing in that regard, especially if they were to be used by a single family. For examples, there are 5 pebble platforms in 5 different rooms and 5 niches also. Could these rather unusual pebble platforms have the same function as the worked stone feature identified by Whitelow in Myrtosfournocorriffi, for which a ritual integrative function was argued? At first, this doesn't sound quite convincing. Firstly, they could simply be some very practical feature linked to the everyday life of the houses. We did find a series of stone tools and querns closely associated with several of them. Secondly, they're found within our buildings and not in a room associated with a courtyard shared by multiple houses. This repetition of architectural features is nonetheless made even more interesting by a specific characteristic of the material assemblage found in their proximity. In many of the rooms, as mentioned, we came across numerous miniature vessels. Before talking about them, we need to be cautious in singling them out. At this very early stage of the pottery analysis, they simply appear prominently because they're easier to spot in the field and often better preserved and less dispersed than other types of vessels. They do, however, appear quite recurrently, and in some rooms in noticeable quantities. These miniature vessels have several traits in common. They are extremely similar, both in terms of dimensions and manufacture. They are rarely found alone. And finally, they're all related to drinking practices. This could suggest, as pointed out by Simona Todaro when she visited us, that such miniature vessels were used to symbolically or practically share, and perhaps more importantly, divide up liquids equally among participants in commensals activity aiming at social reproduction within the households or an extended residential group. Apart from the site of Malya, where similar miniature juglets were found in non-stratified contexts, the best parallel Ilaria Caloi could find come from funerary context, at the Premier Charnier necropolis at Malya and in several Tolus tombs in the Messara, precisely where commensal and drinking activities of a certain importance are attested. So, a question comes to mind. Although we tend to see the prepalatial hamlet at Sissi as a series of independent residences showing similar patterns of domestic activities, very much like Chalepa and Myrtosfournocorriffi, is there a possibility here to argue for the existence of integrative practices within the buildings? And if this was the case, what does this mean in terms of the societal makeup of the households? Do we have several nuclear families using the same building, an extended family with its subunits, or some sort of proto-corporate group? Ensuring social cohesion within a simple nuclear family did not probably require the type of drinking practices I just alluded at. Jan Driessen and I have recently argued in the Oikos volume using Alan Fisk's relational model that at first, during the prepalatial period, sharing food and drinks, a relational pattern called communal sharing by Fisk, might have been enough to ensure cohesion within groups. This, of course, does not preclude that internal competition and hierarchization, well attested in the mortuary record, existed within groups, a pattern called authority ranking by Fisk. We also suggested that as corporate groups or houses with a capital H became larger and or met among themselves, as indicated by the emergence of community hubs around cemeteries, in peak sanctuaries, but also certainly in monumental buildings appearing in EM2B, EM3, simply sharing food wasn't sufficient to ensure cohesion. We argued that, at that stage, the idea of clearly expressing equality between groups of potentially different sizes and or prosperity became essential. This roughly corresponds to a process labeled equality matching by Fisk, and it is usually linked to the fact that different groups need to be able to offer balanced and or equivalent contributions to common activities or communal events. This is often guaranteed, as underlined by Andy Bevan, who was the first to use Fiske theory in Aegean archaeology, through mechanisms such as reciprocity, turn-taking, and equal representation. In another paper, we also argued, Jan and I, that this very process could be at the core of the formation of a true Minoan identity much later on, but this is an altogether different story. Equality matching, as I just described it, can potentially be identified in this Pinakatapoti study of Myrtos Phronocoryphi, where she interpreted the number and distribution of EM2B serving vessels as indicative of moments of sharing, feasts, so to speak, that either follow the principle of rotation, each unit organizing the event at a different moment, or of cooperation, the different units organizing the event collectively. If we come back to Sissi, can we imagine that the clear matching of object sizes and quantities attested by the miniature vessels would reflect balanced contributions to process of active social integration akin to equality matching? And if this was the case, what about the social groups involved in these processes? We have identified equality matching as an inter-house mechanism and not an intra-house one, and I would tend to stick to this opinion. But what does this say about the household groups at the prepalatial hamlet at Sissi, or about the nature of the buildings themselves? At the current stage of the excavation and study, no definitive answer is possible. I can, however, conclude this paper by de-zooming a little and offer you a glimpse at what happened during the EM2B phase at Sissi. This is important because the EM2A phase, and by extension the prepalatial hamlet, can be conceived as a formative period for the rather marked changes appearing in EM2B. On the basis of pottery analysis conducted by Ilaria Caloi, a brief overview of the early Minoan occupation of the area can be presented. Ilaria identified EM2A early deposits under the west wing of the court building, especially in rooms 10-8 and 10-19 that you can see on the on the left of your screen. In the latter, we also found a considerable obsidian deposit currently under study by Tristan Carter. This deposit yielded more than 5,000 fragments, countless blades, and several dozens of nuclei. As indicated earlier, the prepalatial hamlet probably dated to EM2A late, and parts of it were likely abandoned during the same phase. The EM2B occupation of the Sissi Hill appears more widespread than the EM2A one, with evidences in zone 4, 5, and in the cemetery, as you can see on the right of your screen. Where the occupation of the areas of the northwest and west wing of the court building are concerned, both in situ deposits and architectural remains are attested. The latter seem to form a more substantial building that one could even call monumental, judging by the massive EM2B terrace wall later incorporated in the west facade of the neo-palatial court building. One could also imagine that the massive EM2B fill covering part of the prepalatial hamlet that I mentioned earlier actually came from this very area. This monumentalization, so to speak, at Sissi is clearly evocative of a process that is well documented in many areas on the island, including Knossos, Phaistos, and Malia. As pointed out by Todd Whitelow on the basis of well-documented survey evidence, the late prepalatial period witnessed a demographic explosion and important settlement growth in several sites. Among other things, this certainly means that population thresholds were reached in certain settlements, a phenomenon which in turn may have led to increasing social tensions within progressively larger and potentially more diverse communities, and eventually triggered social reconfigurations. This can be related to the appearance of monumental architecture at future palatial sites, with the creation of terrace walls, paved courts, and larger rectangular architectural structures that adopt a more or less north-south orientation that will be retained for centuries afterwards. This process is indeed evocative of the creation of arenas of social reproduction that could have been required due to the coexistence of larger social groups, potentially corporate ones or houses, that met or coexisted at these sites. Large dumps of drinking vases and food remains in some of these early Minoan sites are also quite telling. They may indeed suggest that large-scale gatherings, perhaps feasts accompanying social integration, but also maybe attempts at labor mobilization were taking place. In that regard, could the massive EM2B fill found in the northern area of the prepalatial hamlet, with its many bones, drinking and cooking vessels, be indicative of important feasts linked with the EM2B monumental building? Although detailed analysis by a wide range of specialists are still needed concerning this deposit, this hypothesis is clearly appealing. And I would even go one step further. While excavating the area, we were surprised by the high number of goat horn cores within the deposit, roughly 45 of them. As pointed out recently by Ibi and Sofianou, ovicaprite bone material very often tend to dominate early Minoan phone assemblages. So the presence of goat remains is not too surprising at Sissi, but the presence of horn cores is less common. Concentration of such material has already been encountered in other contexts and interpreted as potential torches in a cave by Dimitra Milona, or considered indicative of horn processing debris at Knossos by Valasia Ezakidou. Within her potential feasting deposit, I would tentatively suggest another hypothesis. Could these horn cores, or goat skulls, if we can find evidence of them, be conceived as tokens of participation in commensal activities? If we are right in seeing equality matching as an important part of inter-houses relations, the different corporate groups meeting at or related to the Sissi EM2B monumental building may be had to each bring a goat to the feast to assert their symbolical equivalence. Within the logic of equality matching, Bevan emphasized the importance of the use of physical placeholders as reminders of the contribution of each group. So one could imagine that the horn cores or skulls were kept as indexes of the group's equivalent participation to the feasts. This, of course, requires further investigation, but I wanted to throw the idea out there to test the waters. In lieu of conclusion, and this will be my last slide, I would like to point out that the fairly long early Minoan occupation of the Sissi Hill can also be related to another key concept of Dreesen's house model, the locus boundness and palimpsestic reuse. This concept is related to the fact that social groups were deeply linked within a distinct local they occupied for long periods of time. We can clearly see this spatial anchorage as constitutive of the corporate's group identity. This locus boundness appeared sometimes so strongly that it transcended time. At Sissi, even if the area of the EM2B monumental building, apparently destroyed by fire, was afterwards abandoned for around 400 years, as we note a general absence or rarity of EM3 MM1A and MM1B2B deposits in the court building, this precise location was selected during the Neopalatial period to create the court building, which clearly incorporated earlier prepalatial walls. And it is certainly in the court next to this early Minoan wall that ceremonies pertaining to processes of equality matching of another magnitude also took place, as shown by pottery studies by Ilaria Caloi and Eniro Mathiudaki. Many thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Quentin. Pretty sure that most of our attendants, they are doing silent clapping, as I'm afraid is the natural thing for online. Thank you so much for what has been one of the clearest presentations I've seen of archaeological data and excavation, and as well one that has moved also from the evidence, the nitty-gritty of the evidence, to think much more broadly about the impact of the excavations at Sissi. And that's only, you haven't even finished your second building, so well done. So for everybody, I will just taking the privilege of being the chair, I will have a couple of questions I would like to ask Quentin. That will hopefully give a bit of time to people to put questions in the chat. If people prefers to do it by voice, that's perfectly fine. But we are a lot of people, so if you just can say on the chat, I have a question, and then I can call your name, and then you can unmute and talk, rather than just being in danger of 3 or 4 people trying to talk all at the same time. So I know who is next. So Quentin, amazing. Thank you so much. As well, it's really interesting because you bring a lot of data from all the excavation back to rethink and back to write digest, and just realizing things like the cores or the horns that we never really pay much attention to it. So that is amazing. There's a few questions that I have in relation as well to the burials, but I think that is a bit unfair because that's a different type of data. So my first question would be a little bit, if you could give us a little bit more information about how you view a little bit the history of the site. EM2A, you say that it's probably a smaller settlement. Is that based on evidence of excavation? Is that a little bit of surface? How you envision that? Then you think EM2B seems to be larger. And then I may be lost about EM3, MM1A. What do you have in terms of, I know that you have in the cemetery, but do you have in terms of the settlement? Just trying to follow up a little bit. What is your really interesting narrative of what's going on socially and politically on the settlement? Mm-hmm. So,
okay, and if Jan is following us, and if I'm saying stupid things, he can interrupt me and answer better, because he has a clearer view than me about the overall history of Sissi. But most of the things I've said today are based on excavation data and not really about what we have from the survey, because we did do a survey of the Sissi area. As I said, the only EM2A remains we have so far are concentrated in that part of the hill, so really around the court building. EM2B appears in several locations on the site, so there's a little bit of the cemetery that can be dated to EM2B. Tests that we have conducted below the post-palatial building on top of the hill also yielded some prepalatial deposits. They're tiny, but they're there. And there are more extensive architectural remains in the west wing and northwest wing of the palace. And these are mostly either EM2A early for parts of them, but most of them are EM2B. So we do have the impression that by EM2B, there is a larger occupation of the site. And the last time we talked about that, Jan and I discussed the fact that what could happen in EM2B at Sissi could be some sort of nucleation of the small hamlets that I mentioned earlier. So they were like a couple, like maybe 5 of them with Sissi, and maybe that at EM2B, there was some sort of a nucleation process that took place. And that could, to some extent, explain the fact that there was a need of a more larger building around which, feasts that could have an integrative function might have happened, or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because EM2B on the burial side of things, we struggle with it. Do we really not find it? We don't know if it has been cleared out, and there might be something going on. But what you are showing today, it's a little bit different to what we see in burials, which is what a lot of the narratives have been created in terms of how those move. We see those changes that talk about more people coming together, about practices. Those seems to take over, at least with evidence that we have EM3, MM1A. That is as well the case for your cemetery, isn't it? That
yeah, it is. I know that Todd would tend to place this demographic explosion I was mentioning to EM3, MM1A rather than EM2B. But we very well know that these trajectories might vary from site to site, and maybe the chronological resolution we have do not really allow us to be that accurate. But
you have a better resolution. I think most of the other sites we are comparing to, so I think it's a little bit the opposite.
Yeah.
Okay, I could continue this conversation for another 40 minutes, but I think it's time to move the questions to other people. Okay, I'm going to start with a short one, and then I'll move it to Nicoletta, which has a couple of questions she will ask herself. There is a question here from Miriam, which I think is a quick one. What kind of stones are the consolidated horn cores? So
I'm not sure I understand the question.
It's horn, aren't they? So there are no stones at all.
No. They're it's really like the central part of the keratin, the central part of the horn that we found, and they're very, very delicate and fragile. But you can really see them in the deposit. So they're the actual inside of the horn. Okay,
I will then move to Nicoletta. Nicoletta, do you want to unmute, and perhaps do you want to do your questions?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Perfectly well.
Good. I was going to ask two questions, but the first one was answered very, very clearly in your last slide. That is about the nature of the end of the early Minoan 2B fill. What I'm not entirely clear about is the character of the pottery in this early Minoan 2B fill, but you may not be able to answer that. But when was this created? Is the fill created before or after the destruction? And by the way, thank you for one of the clearest presentations I've ever heard. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's very kind of you. Are you asking about the destruction of the EM2A hamlet, right?
EM2B, the EM2B, because you talked of this very big EM2B fill. So, when was this created? Before or after the destruction?
Yeah, to give you a definitive answer, we will need more time and the proper, pottery study to be conducted. But what I can tell you is that this type of fill also continues in the EM2B building. So on some of the EM2B remains that we have in the northwest wing of the palace, we encounter the same type of very dense pottery fill with bones and animal remains and stuff like that.
But so, stratigraphically, you should be able to tell.
It's above the walls, so it's probably post-date the construction of the EM2B village. The EM2B more monumental structure, let's say.
Yeah. Okay. So is this a clearing made after the destruction?
I could make an educated guess, but I shouldn't answer that because I'm not sure yet. But I'm sure that Ilaria will work very fast and will be able to provide us with better answer in the years to come.
Thank you.
I have a question here as well, a short one from Lucia. She says, you mentioned a beehive in room 1021. Yeah. Is that a shared identified as a beehive?
Yeah, it's not a complete vessel. It's part of a beehive. I mean, of what seems to be a beehive, or what has been identified as such by pottery specialists, or by me. I can't really remember honestly.
Robert Cole as well asks, great talk. Is residue analysis being conducted on the miniatures? I'm thinking in psychotropic substances. We have been the focus of attention recently.
That would be pretty cool if it was that. I guess we could eventually do that. All the material is there. It has been extracted in a way that would allow us to do residue analysis without any problem. And we have many of the miniature vessels, and some of them are already broken. So the type of process that you should need to do residue analysis could be done on such material. So this is definitely something that we will keep in mind and try to do in the future.
It's really interesting to when you talk about the miniatures. Some of the ones we found on the tombs as well are stone vessels. So there might be as well something tell us about how important they might socially, that they are playing with different materials. Some of them, like the stone vessels, could be something a little bit more prestigious. So that's interesting to put a context on the use of those.
And I should probably also point out that Ilaria wrote me an email right before the talk telling me that I shouldn't call these vessels miniature. Okay. Because if you call something miniature, it means that there is a larger form of it that exists in their repertoire, which is not necessarily the case. But I told her that miniature sounds much better than tiny or smaller vessels. So let's all agree that they're not technically miniature, but they're tiny. They're about 5 centimeters in height.
Perfect. So Yanis, I'm a little bit talking about pottery, so this is relevant to that. Many thanks, Quentin. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but my feeling is that the EM2A assemblage is not fully representative of a normal domestic assemblage. What about large storage jars and pithoi, large basins and other large vases? Do you think that you are missing spaces for storing? Could such places be placed somewhere else and be of more of a collective character? So what's your feeling about big pot?
It's a good question. I do believe that in building one, we do have like storage jars and some vats and large basins. Ilaria told me about them, especially in the room, the apsidal room, which contained quite a significant number of miniature vessels. We also found basins and vats and things like that. The only fragment of the pithos that we securely identified comes from the other building within the M2B pottery fill, but there isn't a room in the building that would be used only for storage. I think they're probably multifunctional room, like the type of room that you encounter at Myrtus Fornocorifie, where you have a bit of like small craft industry, a bit of like storage and things like that. But to answer that question more accurately, we will need to excavate the whole thing, and we know that walls continues on each side of the area that we worked on, so we will be able to answer that more precisely in the future.
Yes, I'm just remind me a little bit of Aphrodite Kephali, which is much earlier, but they have plenty of pithoi there.
Yeah,
might be a very different kind of use. So that will be interesting as well in terms of that. Okay, let's move to the next question. Todd, at Halepa, there is a surprising dearth of pithoi. We are coming to the same question. If not a burn destruction, then were such vessels salvaged? These raise questions of why the jugglers were left. Were these abandonment, post-abandonment depositions, closing deposits? So a little bit probably thinking much more as well. I thought it was to go out the taphonomic processes that you might be encountering. Any? Well,
it's the impression that I had while excavating the building is that they were caught in the collapse of the building. So they were left in place, and then the building collapsed after a while. And there's a quite thick layer of sediments between the actual archaeological deposits and the collapse, which means that the building was left open for a while and then slowly disintegrated, and then the wall finally collapsed on top of that. We found these small vessels, these miniature vessels in various locations, sometimes in the niches, and it looks like they were stored in them, but also sometimes in the middle of a room. So in room 1025, there is a lump of these miniature vessels, and they were weirdly mixed with pumice. So we had like several pumice stones mixed with the raki cups and the small juglets. And this looks more like something that may have been deposited there at some time. It doesn't look like it's stored there. It was too messy an assemblage to be something that was stored in that area in the room, which is not really convenient. It's right in the middle of it. But I wouldn't consider them post-abandonment. I think they were in the building, which slowly disintegrated, and then it collapsed on top of it. But I agree that the very few large storage container we have identified so far is intriguing. But if Ilaria was there and she had a look at the material for 2 weeks, I think already, she could be able to contradict what I'm saying here. But as far as I know, we do not have a lot of pithos material.
I asked in a similar way, a direction. What about the stone tools? With respect to find querns, with respect to find, hands, that kind of things. Is something that you found or as well?
Yeah, let me just quickly go back to, because I see Todd asked the second question. It might be the case. if we keep in mind the fact that they may have closed the cavities that I mentioned with, you know, like these shells and the bits of stalactite, maybe, I mean, I don't see any reason why these vessels could not be part of a pre-collapse deposit for some of them. But again, we're at a very preliminary stage of the study. It's probably a bit too soon to offer you a definitive answer for that question. For the querns and stone tools, we found loads of them in all the rooms. They're often associated with the pebble platform, and I had the question in another talk, so I'm going to be a bit more detailed about that. We call them platform because they're a few centimeters above the actual floors in the room. So they're not part of the floor surface per se. They're a bit higher, and they appear in a lot of room. And to my knowledge, I don't know many other prepalatial sites who have that installations so frequently distributed within a building. But we do have like querns. Some of them are also reused querns in the masonry of walls, but also a lot of like, you know, pounder hammers and stuff like that. And it's
you have those activities that you respect from domestics. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Lucy Goodison makes a commentary here about Hamesi, and it says that the Varas, I think, established that there in the excavation of the site that the shape of the hill, it was not the shape of the hill that dictated the oval shape. So a little bit on your ideas of.
Yeah, but that would be even more interesting. That would mean that this tradition of oval or apsidal building would continue much later than what I said. And I think it's maybe I'm mistaken, but I have the impression that with recent excavation, it's something that we start seeing much more clearly now, that there is indeed a lot of oval and apsidal buildings in early Minoan period.
Okay, Andrew Shapland goes back to the horns and says, have the horn cores been studied in detail yet? In the palatial periods, animal heads do seem to have been deposited as part of commensal consumption events, but there should be cut marks around the base of the horn if removed for horn working, and there could be other processing marks.
So no, as everything I said so far, nothing is being studied in full detail because we're in the middle of it. But we will keep that in mind, and that's a very interesting comment, because if we have parallels in later period of goat skulls being used as commensal consumption deposits, that would be really cool to show. But no, and it's Valasia Izakidou and her team that will be in charge of studying the horn cores.
Yeah, it's assumed that there were proper horns and only the cores have preserved. Is that the working assumption?
That's a good question. Yes, probably, because that would be really weird to just extract the horn cores. It's probably disintegrated because of the, I don't know, the type of soil in which they were embedded.
Okay, all right. There are no questions, so I'm going to poke you a little bit, thinking more broadly. We're talking about households and how societies are more corporate, and how that fits a lot of with what theoretical. I think most of us, we are moving in that direction in terms of that tension between cooperation and competition, and we see that on the archaeological record of Prepalatial and Prepalatial. On the other hand, when you go to the cemeteries, things start to be not that homogeneous. If you start to think about practices that they are shared, that they are common across Crete, well, it doesn't really fit very well what we have with the cemeteries. They change in the north coast from Tholos tombs that you will expect to have a very different relationship with the site as, for example, your house tombs or your rectangular tombs that are more typical from where you have a Sissi or where you have a Gurnia. So I found that tension in terms of, I'm not really sure if those systems are all working the same way or on the same circumstances. So what's your take on this?
So the point you're making is that there marked difference between the funerary record and we
expect that those have a clear impact or a clear to what are the identities that they establish or they structure those communities. So how you see that, or even how you see it in relation to Sissi from the
I mean, if I remember well, a paper you wrote yourself in 2016, you show that there is indeed a competition going on in the groups, but that when different groups meet together, they tend to deploy some collaborative practices and things like that, and that this tension between collaboration and some sort of hierarchization is intriguing, and that we need to pay more attention to that. And in my opinion, this is what I also see in residential and domestic, more domestic settings, if you want, especially if you start considering not only the buildings but the areas around which the building are organized, and if you see that as an area in which different households may connect. And the tension between hierarchization and collaboration is probably expressed in the relation between internal spaces of the household and the area in which they communicate outside, which is something that is fairly similar to what may happen in the tombs, really. What we know at Sissi with the house tombs is fairly similar to what happens elsewhere. I mean, they're consumption events.
Yes, but then you have the Tholos tombs in other places, so that seems to be in a different one. I think for the EM2A, EM2B, I don't know because I'm not very sure, but the picture in EM2A seems very, very different. While in the later tombs, in the more late prepalatial EM3, MM1, you are going to see those practices more identifiable or comparable across many cemeteries. Yeah. So just talking a little bit how you see that in Sissi, if you see as well a change, we cannot understand exactly what it means between that EM2A to what it be in your case seems to be EM2B, very different kind of site, and how you think those will affect the way you think about it. You think there is a major change in how those relationships between household and larger corporate groups change? Are we looking at something that evolves through those periods?
Yeah, well, that's interesting because, I mean, so far we have nothing in the cemetery that is as early as EM2A, right? So we're not quite sure what was happening on the site at that time. Was there even a cemetery at Sissi while this little hamlet was existing? So that's the first thing. And maybe we needed some sort of nucleation in EM2B to have an actual cemetery on the site. That I don't know. So I think it's a bit probably too soon now to go into details about what happened at Sissi and the relation that may have existed between the small hamlets and if a cemetery ever existed.
It is a bit of an unfair question. I'm just trying to pick up your brains and see where it's taking you. So no worries. I think it was a bit unfair.
I talk to Jan if you want, like, educated guess about what was happening at Sissi. He's entitled to do that.
Yes. Well, it happens everywhere else. I guess my question is what happens in Sissi comparable to how many other places on Crete? Crete seems to be a very big island, and we'll expect to see variations on those. So
yeah, of course.
Any other questions? People would like to join in? Anybody else would like to pose a question to Quentin? Anything about households? Anything about the particular site of Sissi? I think we stand them into silence, Quentin. I have to say, I'm not surprised that I know a lot of questions because, as Nicoletta says, it's one of the clearest presentations I've seen, particularly excavation, which tends to be extremely detailed and for people as well that are not on the site. So there are no more questions. So Quentin, I just would like to thank you so much for what has been a very interesting presentation. What has been a very clear introduction to the Prepalatial of Sissi in what is data that we lack, particular habitational good data. Best of luck with the excavation, and I'm sure there is much more data we would like to see. And I think for everybody that has attended today, thank you so much.